Hello and welcome to this technical demonstration of Exicco. This is a drain cavity system which is designed for lightweight steel frame buildings and can also be used on timber applications. Here we have a typical build-up of the substrate prior to the installation of the system. This is an example of a lightweight steel frame system with a sheathing board and a breather membrane. So the system will be mechanically fixed directly to this substrate. We will now show you how the system is installed. The base profile is fixed at 300mm centres. Frame rails are fixed around the perimeter of all openings. Corner rails are fixed to the external corners of the building. Spacer rails are fixed vertically at 600mm centres and at 300mm centres at edge zones. Non-ventilated fire barriers are fixed around all openings. Intermittent ventilated fire barriers are fixed horizontally at floor slab level. Non-ventilated fire barriers are fixed vertically at the specified zones to provide compartmentalisation. Deflection rails are fitted above all openings to ensure any moisture build-up is suitably diverted. We've now got the first stage of the system installed. As you can see, we've got the spacer rails fitted vertically, frame rails around the windows, corner rails at the external corners of the building, and deflection rails to channel any moisture away above the window heads. Moving on to the fire barriers, we have a vertical non-ventilated fire barrier for compartmentalisation between properties to stop the spread of flame through the building. We have a non-ventilated fire barrier around the window, again to stop the spread of flame coming out from the window into the system. And then finally we have the ventilated fire barrier which is fitted at the floor slab level in between the rails, and this barrier will expand in the event of a fire. Once we've reached this stage, we're now ready to start the boarding works. Compriband seal tape is applied around the perimeter of the system. The insulation boards are aligned in a brick bond fashion. The insulation boards are mechanically fixed with the specified fixings, including an oversized washer. L-shaped sections of insulation are fitted around all structural openings. Cut sections of insulation must be no less than 200mm in width. Insulation boards are staggered at internal and external corners. Exicco is popular for high-rise applications, and wind loading calculations are used to determine the position of the spacer rails. Exicco will have a project-specific fixing pattern, and the position of the spacer rails will determine this. The position of the window frame in relation to the substrate will determine the detailing to the window reveals. As you can see, we've now got the insulation fitted. Looking at the configuration of the boards, we've got them aligned in a brick bond fashion. We've got L-shaped sections around the openings, and we have them staggered at the external corners. We also have compriband seal tape around the perimeter of the entire system. Moving on, looking at the fixing pattern, on the left hand side we have the edge zone of the building where we have the rail centres at 300mm. This is due to wind loading on the building, especially on high rise. And to the right hand side we have the mid zone where we have the fixings and rails at 600mm centres. As you can see, there's a lot less fixings in this area. Once we are happy with this, we can then proceed to the base coat. The HP14 base coat is supplied in 25 kilo bags. It's marked with a batch number and date of manufacture. The product must be used 12 months from this date and stored in dry conditions. The material is mechanically mixed with 6 litres of clean water for 5 minutes minimum. It is then left to stand for 5 minutes. It is then reworked and ready for application. Stage 1, fit the corner beads embedded into the wet material, line and level. The material is applied at 4 to 6 millimeters thick. The material is then serrated vertically using a notched rule or trowel. The mesh is laid vertically into the top third of the wet material. All joints in the mesh must be overlapped by 100 millimeters minimum. Stress patches must be fitted at all structural openings, and these are 500 millimeters long by 250 millimeters wide.
Okay, so we've applied our HP14 and we've notched it. We've put our mesh on, and as you can see here, I've extended the mesh right to the point of the angle bead on the head and down the side of the reveal. And the reason why I do that is if you install the mesh just behind the plastic in this location, vertically or horizontally, there's always the possibility that this small area here will have no mesh, and if the stress patch is fitted in the wrong area, there's the possibility that it could crack.
Fixings are then installed through the mesh at 1 meter centres while the material is still wet. Once the fixings are installed, 100 by 100 millimeter mesh patches are placed over the fixing heads and then trowelled onto the same plane as the primary mesh. The material is then allowed to cure for 24 hours in favourable weather conditions. The first stage of the base coat and mesh application is now complete. As you can see, the material has been serrated and the mesh has been laid onto the top third of the wet material. The mesh has been suitably overlapped vertically at 100 millimeters, and stress patches have been applied at the structural openings. Those are 500 long by 250 wide. It's crucial the stress patch is fitted diagonally and it hits this point. If it's fitted any higher, this area is then susceptible to cracking. Another key point when installing the fixings through the mesh is that the fixing head is covered with render and the mesh patch, and it is pushed onto the same plane as the primary mesh. This again is important to achieve good flatness within the system. Now this stage is completed, we can move on to the slurry coat. Apply the material to the cured base coat at 2 to 3 millimeters thick. Level and flatten the material using a spatula. The material can then be finished by either one of the two options. Option 1, finish with a sponge float in a circular motion to produce a flat finish. Option 2, finish with a spatula and then remove any trowel lines with a rasp once the product is cured, typically 24 hours in favourable weather conditions. So now we've completed the slurry coat, and as you can see, the wall's looking nice and flat. It's important that the wall's flat because we don't want any undulations showing through on the finished surface. We've used two different methods of application. We've used the sponge method here, and on this area we've used the spatula and rasp method. Both methods produce a flat surface, which again is very important for the top coat. The particle size on the top coat is typically 1.5 mil, so it will show through if there's any undulations in the base coat. Again, really important that this is checked for flatness prior to moving to the next stage. Once this is checked, we're ready to go to the primer and top coat stage. The TC primer is supplied in 15 kilogram tubs. It's marked with a batch number and a date of manufacture, and it also has a 12-month shelf life. The primer must be mixed before use, and a small amount of water may be added to improve the workability. The primer is then applied by roller or brush, ensuring the entire area is covered, including all edges. The The primer must then be left to cure until touch dry. Once the primer is cured, the top coat can be applied. The silicone TC is supplied in 25 kilogram tubs. It's marked with a batch number and date of manufacture. It has a 12-month shelf life from date of manufacture. The silicone TC must be mixed before use, and a small amount of water may be added to improve the workability. During periods of cold, humid weather, TC additive can be added to the silicone TC to speed up the curing process and eliminate the risk of wash-off. The silicone TC is applied to the wall at a depth of the grain, typically 1.5 millimeters, and then any excess material is removed. The silicone TC is then rolled in a circular motion with a plastic float, and any excess material is removed. Once the excess material is removed, then a final pass is required to achieve the desired finish. The final stage of the system is now complete, and as you can see, the silicone TC has been applied to the wall. If we look closely at the wall, we can see that the material has been applied to the correct depth of 1.5 millimeters, and it's been finished to a good standard, nice and flat with an even dispersion of grain across the facade. If we look at the detailing at the external angles, we can see that these are nice and crisp, and they've been formed nice and sharp with a nice clean arris, which is what we like to see. Once the product is fully cured, we can then remove the protective film from the windows and other interfacers, and then we can apply a mastic sealant to these areas. Once we have completed this, the system is finished and can be handed over to the client for inspection.